A tired businessman in a tight suit has just gotten out of work and enters a crowded train. As the train moves, the man looks around to find anything that will keep his mind off of his job. He finds an old woman, another one in a nursing scrub, and a middle-aged man reading a book. Because of his interest in literature, the businessman becomes curious to find out what this book is, but unexpectedly, he is puzzled. The book features no words, but panels of pictures. The characters are wearing tight costumes and their body figures are heavily exaggerated. The businessman understands that what he is looking at is a comic book, but it is the middle-aged reader that is confusing. Heck, he even remembers when he used to read them as a little boy, but now that little boy has grown up and is looking down at the middle-aged reader because he does not realize the significance of comic books. He does not realize that comic books are not merely children's books. They are pieces of our history, American history. Close your eyes and make a mental picture of what you think a comic book looks like. Tell me, what do you see? A book with flashy colors and text bubbles? Or something that looks like a school's history book? If one were to compare a World War II comic book to a history book, they would surprisingly see a noticeable reflection. Not only is this comparison noticeable, but it carries influential characteristics. It's hard to imagine that something as childish as a comic book could tell the story of a whole country in a few pages. They have gone from lifting up the spirits of Americans during the Great Depression to helping the soldiers fight Hitler and the Nazis to even causing a worldwide anti-comic movement. Let's go back to the beginning of the comic book industry. In 1863, black and white newspaper comic strips were not as popular nor diverse as they are now. Not many people paid attention to them because their sole purpose was for business advertisements. But on February 16th, the comic industry had gotten its first big break. The idea to add color to newspaper strips added a whole new dimension to the content. From this innovation, a star was born, the Yellow Kid. The Yellow Kid stories featured a mischievous boy who went through various adventures while bothering his fellow neighbors. His trademark was the unique yellow color of his hat and clothing, as the rest of the artwork was in black and white. The strip had given readers a new way to look at comics along with funny and witty commentary. The strip had become a major success, and due to the lack of copyright legal issues, the Yellow Kid was able to be featured in 2 newspapers. Such varied publications only increased the recognition of the strip around the country. And with this growing popularity came better public familiarity with American comic books. Soon, comic strips had evolved during the early 1900s, and their characteristics began to mature. Now that comic strips were able to tackle mature issues, female-oriented comic strips like Martin Branner's Winnie Winkle and Westover's Tilly the Toilet also gained recognition. The demand for these new strips was influenced by the flapper movement of the 1920s. The word flapper was first coined in Britain after the war to describe a young girl who was still awkward and had not entered womanhood. But soon, a flapper was a word that described an unorthodox, optimistic woman in the Roaring '20s. Such characteristics were seen in female comic strips and developed a new view of marital life, as the husbands in those stories were displayed as helpless buffoons, and the women represented the fledgling patriotic way. This combination of the flapper movement and female-oriented comics served as the origins for the liberal strive for women independency, later seen throughout American history like the women's rights movement. Unfortunately, the flapper movement had abruptly ended in 1929 when the global stock market had collapsed. The unfortunate event led to the worldwide Great Depression during the 1930s. Rather than dying out because of the stringent local prices, comics and other cartoons thrived off of the American people's vulnerability. Though made 9 months before the stock market crash, comics like Tarzan and Buck Rogers symbolized America's desire for escaping from the tough depression. Other cartoons such as the friendly and amorphic characters of Disney also helped the healing process. The theme from Disney's Three Little Pigs, called Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf, became America's anti-depression anthem. Soon the industry had experienced other prominent events as well during the 1930s. MC Gaines, a salesman and newspaper syndicate agent, had produced popular comics and brought the original Superman strip to Action Comics. The idea of an alien coming to Earth and having all the superpowers that Superman had was unique and daring. Fortunately, Detective Comics had made a risky decision on publishing Superman, and soon Bob Kane's Batman was also introduced in May 1939. The two superheroes would serve as pioneers for the superhero genre, and shortly, hundreds of other Superman and Batman copies and lookalikes would appear in future publications. For more information on the rise of comics, I went to the Million Year Picnic in Harvard Square, where I met the store owner, Tony Davis.
Okay, well, comics in America are born out of the Sunday newspaper strips, or the newspaper strips in general. I mean, those predate the comic book by 2 to 3 decades. And, you know, the comics industry, as we know it, the comic book industry, was born during the Great Depression. You had an unemployed Jewish school teacher, Max Gaines, who, like a lot of Jewish entrepreneurs during the time, was looking for a business that could feed his family and hopefully make him rich. And unfortunately, in 1933, Max is at a low ebb. He and his family have moved back in with his mom. And to comfort himself, he starts reading these old comic strips that were stored in his mother's attic. And he suddenly realizes that they're as funny and entertaining the second and third time that he's reading them as they were when he initially read them in the newspapers. So he calls up a friend who works for a company that happens to print most of the Sunday comic page inserts on the East Coast, and they come up with an idea. Let's take essentially those Sunday funnies, fold them again. They're roughly the size of a comic book. We'll sell them on newsstands and see if this works. And that led to the first comic book, Famous Funnies. So all of the initial comic books were reprints of newspaper strips. And then some people like Will Eisner come along and start setting up companies to make original content for comic books. And originally it's all adventure strips. You know, pirates, soldiers of fortune, science fiction. And then there are these two kids, Schuster and Siegel, out of Cleveland, who are shopping a comic strip called Superman. And they start shopping Superman in the early 30s, like 1933. And nobody wants to publish it. All the newspapers reject it. Will Eisner actually said that he sent them a fairly condescending letter saying that they should probably go back to art school and work some more on their craft. And at some point, Max Gaines sees this strip. Actually, no, somebody else sees this strip, brings it to Max Gaines, and essentially they set up a company to publish what turns out to be Action Comics #1. Actually, the company exists at that point. But they publish Superman #1, and it's an incredible hit because it's like unlike anything else in the comic strips. And that's really the birth of the superhero comic book. Comes out of Superman. And it's a fairly, you know, like I said, they created this strip in 1933, and it's not until 1938 that Superman, you know, that Action #1 actually gets published. So that's an idea that's kicking out there for 4 or 5 years. And like the film industry, and like I said, the comic book industry was filled with like a lot of Jewish entrepreneurs who didn't necessarily love comics as a medium, weren't necessarily creative people, but they attracted other creative people to work with them. I think Will Eisner is one of the few examples of a guy who was a gifted writer and artist and also had that entrepreneurial spirit. So Will was sort of doing both ends, the business end and the creative end. But most of the publishers, they were simply looking for content that they could put out there that the public would like, and once something became a hit, they would try to go out and find 20, 30, 40 more things like it. And, you know, particularly given that it was the Great Depression, that the country was in not only an economic slump, but a real slump in terms of morale. Just like Shirley Temple films, the comic book resonated with people. It was great escapism. So pretty much within a few years, you know, comic books went from almost nothing at all to selling tens of millions of copies.
At the beginning of the 1940s, the war in Europe had gotten worse and quickly spread throughout the globe. Germany's Adolf Hitler had earned the title of a villain after his atrocious acts in France and other neighboring countries. Due to the need of fresh ideas and growing national hate for the Nazis, the comic book industry had decided to make use of the war. As America got involved with the global struggle, comic artists Jack Kirby and Joe Simon had concocted a superhero that quickly became a comic legend. Like Superman, but without the godlike powers, such as flying and X-ray vision. Captain America was created in order to represent the American way and show support for the battle against the Nazis. The cover page of Captain America issue number 1 even showed the hero punching Hitler in the face. Talk about making an entrance. With the Captain's success being noticed all around the comic book industry, superheroes from all over were joining the fight against Hitler. From Superman to the Spirit to other low-recognized superheroes, it seemed that everyone in the comic book world was in World War II. The countless amounts of World War II superhero comic books published not only helped people support the war at home, but also those fighting in the war. In a 2012 interview, Steve Canaris, a main partner at Granby's Free Lunch Studios, has shared his thoughts about the comic book's influential effects on World War II. He states that the superhero was really created for World War II. When shipped overseas, the GIs wanted them and asked for them. The fictional superheroes kept the American soldiers focused as well as determined. During World War II, the comic industry had done its part to contribute to an American win, but soon its services were not needed. The end of the war gave way to a peaceful era in American history. Everyone was tired of seeing warlike violence in comics. As quick as he was created, Captain America had been put aside and his warlike approach was now unneeded. American citizens were demanding more realistic storylines. According to Harvey Kurtzman, a well-known comic book publisher, the typical American war comic displayed that Americans are good guys and anybody against us is the bad guys. We're human. They're not. And God is always on our side. This trash had nothing to do with the reality of life. The new wave of comics that fed America's realistic, passive yearnings was love, crime, and horror-oriented comics. Comic books like Harvey, Crime Does Not Pay, and Tales from the Crypt began to become favorites within the 1950s American audience. Like the superhero genre, the new comics boomed out of hundreds of different titles, but soon this aggressive nature took a major toll on the industry. In order to gain more fans and profit, comic book publishers tried to outgrow and outsex each other. This led to the horrific and almost pornographic comic books on the shelves of daily newspaper stands. As these scandalous comics continued to be sold, a German psychologist named Frederick Wertham began his attack on the comic book industry. During the early 1950s, Dr. Wertham wrote a symbolic book that almost single-handedly obliterated comic books out of history. That book was called The Seduction of the Innocents. The Seduction of the Innocents book was perfectly crafted to illustrate a terrible depiction of comic book. In the book, Dr. Wertham would isolate certain comic book panels and take them out of their context in order to create a portrayal completely different from the original stories. Most of the other panels and captions suggested sexual parts and fantasies. According to the comic book history of comics, the list of additional ideas was long. 1. Comics are racist. Comics desensitize children to gore and out violence. Comics give girls unrealistic body figures. Comics promote homosexual behavior. Comic art contains subliminal sexual images. Comics teach kids how to commit crimes. Superheroes are fascist. Comics are filled with ads for products unhealthy to children. Comics are bad for children's eyes. Comics promote illiteracy and discourage the reading of real books. All comic books are really crime comic books. Comics revel in bondage and S&M imagery. Comics teach that strength is power and that problems can only be solved through fighting. In order to gain a better insight on Frederick Wertham's influence in the comic industry, we go back to Tony Davis.
So this is a guy who's out there fighting the good fight on a number of fronts to try to protect American kids. So Wertham, I think, does two things. He looks at America and he's trying to figure out why we're such a violent society. And he's looking at our media because he doesn't want America to become like his old country, Germany, warlike. So he's looking at our media and he looks at comic books, and one, he identifies comic books as only being for kids, which I think post-World War II just wasn't true. You know, you'd had a lot of GIs reading comic books in the trenches. There were a lot of adults who read comic books. The same as, you know, currently there are not only tons of adults, but tons of adults in the United States, but tons of adults in Europe and Japan who've read comic books their entire lives. And so he also uses really bad scientific method, which is he doesn't take a cross-section of American kids. He essentially hands comic books to the disturbed youths that he works with and says, what do you think about this? Well, they're disturbed youths. I mean, they look at the comic books and what they see, what they pull out of them are all these sort of sexual and violent connotations, some of which just aren't even there. I mean, literally, there's one panel in Seduction of the Innocent where he looks at, like, Tarzan's shoulder joint and says, you know, this may look like a shoulder joint to you, but to a youth, it looks like a woman's pelvic region, you know, like a woman's vagina. And it's just ridiculous. But really what he does is he creates this, panic is too strong a word, but it's one of the first real times that you have the culture war begin in America, where people are looking at youth culture. I mean, they'd already fought like films, and you had the Hays Office and the censorship of movies. But this is like a time when they're sort of saying there's children's media and there's adult media, and we're considering comic books to be a child's medium, and we're not going to let adult content be in a child's medium because we think it leads directly to juvenile delinquency. And we'll later see this fought on rock and roll. We'll see this fight with hip hop. We'll see this fight with video games. This idea that if we think it's mostly affecting kids, we need to censor it. We need to control it. And then you've got some guys like E.C. Gaines, who's the son of Max Gaines, the guy who did Famous Funnies. Not E.C. Gaines, Bill Gaines, who who's running his dad's company, E.C. Comics. And he's moved it away from religious comics and funnies to Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, Weird Science, Two-Fisted Tales, and later Mad Magazine. And they don't articulate the reasons that there should be creative freedom very well. They don't really get the political nuances. And they lose the fight. Eventually, the comics industry volunteers to censor itself so that there won't be a government censorship office. And really what happens is that several of the big companies, Marvel, DC, get together and draw up a comics code that they know will crush the smaller companies like EC Comics. So it's not really just sanitizing the comics, it's destroying a lot of the competition. So a lot of the lurid crime comics, horror comics, the most exhilarating science fiction comics, they all disappear overnight. And really comics stay that way for a long, long time. And I would say the effect of the code is similar to the effect of prohibition on the American wine industry, which is that, while the French and other people continue to march ahead with their industry, ours gets stunted, gets juvenilized.
The comic codes were established in the same year as Seduction of the Innocents, and their purpose was to regulate the content of all comic books sold. If a comic book displayed acceptable traits, the comic code seal would slap on a seal of approval to allow the selling of the literature. The shortage of variety had also come at a wrong time in history. In the 1950s, television started to emerge in the living rooms of American families, and the presence of televised entertainment had weakened the necessity of comics. Around 15 comic businesses had collapsed during the comic code days and never returned to the surface. In the 70s, Marvel, owned by icon Stan Lee, was still up and running. Lee stood up for comic books worldwide when he released the Amazing Spider-Man issue, number 96. In the comic, Spider-Man says, "How do you warn the kids? How do you reach them?" Our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man was talking to the comic codes because they forbid comics to talk about drugs, whether good or bad. The Despite these restrictions, the Comic Code's president at the time, John Goldwater, decided to approve the comic. If he had not done so, the Spider-Man comic would have sold well and weakened the power of the Comic Codes. With this event came a change in the Code's policies. In January 1971, the Code allowed stories with drugs, sympathy for villains and criminals, less strict dress codes, and seduction. Though censorship towards the comics was still evident, these lighter restrictions returned comics to their original nature and rid them of unwanted, controversial subjects such as gore and explicit themes. As the Comic Codes lightened up, Dr. Wardham had also changed his opinion on the comic book fandom. In 1974, a new look Wardham had released a book that contradicted his early publications. It favored young comic book fans who exemplified loyalty and non-violent communication between each other. Wardham had realized the importance of comics for the American youth, and his character reformation had signaled the return of colorful comics in the United States. Since then, the comic book industry has remained a prominent force in American culture. Though their relationship with political subjects has decreased over the years, comic books are still seen as giants when it comes to pop culture. Over the past 10 years, games, movies, and ebooks focused on comic book superheroes have proven to be both economically and culturally successful. Recent blockbusters such as Marvel's The Avengers, The Dark Knight, and The Dark Knight Rises have presented themselves as the highest-grossing comic book adaptation movies of all time. Without a doubt, more comic superheroes will grace the big screen with their presence and continue to extend the borders of the comic book universe. The comic book industry's contributions to this country have been historically documented throughout the years. Hopefully, one day, that tired businessman will take notice of these marquee events and understand why the middle-aged man was reading the childish comic book. When relationships such as comic books and American history exist, it does not matter how old you are to enjoy culture, because both histories will forever intertwine.